Thank you very much. Good evening, fellow speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I just really want to thank Joe Mulholland and his wonderful team for inviting me to be here again, but also once again for putting on such an interesting programme, which I think will really stimulate minds this week. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office. So wrote Seamus Heaney in his great poem for International Human Rights Day, entitled From the Republic of Conscience, written almost 30 years ago today. Even the title itself is evocative, projecting an image of the kind of polity that we would all like to live in. Not just a free and independent republic, but a republic where the symptoms of creeping privilege disappear and lightning spells universal good. I've been thinking a lot about the work of Seamus Heaney ever since I had the pleasure to visit the Heaney exhibition in Emory University in Atlanta over the St. Patrick's Day weekend. And there I got to see a lot more of the poet than I'd seen before. I got to see his writing desk from the 1980s, made out of 2 planks from an old bench at Carysfort College, where he once taught. And I also got to read some of his correspondence with other writers and look at some of his poems in draft and completed form. And reading some of his poems and some of the material, I was struck by one thing in particular that I didn't really expect, and that was Heaney was not always the confident poet of later years, the man who would deservedly win a Nobel Prize for Literature and inspire so many people in Ireland and around the world with his words. He admitted that the writing style in his collection North reflected the tension that he himself was feeling in the 1970s. He moved at that time from Belfast to Wicklow and was about to move to Dublin and felt incredible pressure to engage actively with the political events in Northern Ireland at the time. And it was a time when he said he was struggling for confidence, expecting his collection to be hammered by the critics, trusting his poems, but not how they would be received. And in his poem Oysters, in his later collection Fieldwork, he said, "He was angry that my trust could not repose in the clear light like poetry or freedom." And it's for this reason that one literary critic referred to an anxiety of trust in the early work of Heaney. He faced the struggle to come to terms with a number of things: his own identity, the political struggle on the island, and his own emerging talent as a poet. And trust can be a difficult issue for a politician, as well as for poets. And I wonder sometimes, do we suffer from that anxiety of trust as well in politics? At its simplest level, it's the cynicism that is out there when it comes to politics and to politicians. And this is referenced in the Council of Europe report of 2012 as public distrust in democracy. It's also evident from the surveys that have been done in this country, in which politicians score low compared to almost all other professions. Doctors, incidentally, score quite highly. And even though I'm a doctor and a politician and could take some comfort in the higher score, I actually wonder is there not something wrong when we've so little faith collectively in the people we elect to govern on our behalf. And perhaps it was always so. Suspicion in our politicians goes all the way back to ancient times. What was the assassination of Julius Caesar but a particularly brutal way of confirming a collective loss of confidence in a political leader? But I wonder if there's a bigger problem still. And perhaps that bigger problem is that politicians don't really trust the people. We saw that recently when the attempt to create a directly elected mayor for Dublin was opposed by some local politicians who were afraid of losing some of their power, and who sacrificed the opportunity of reform because of the fear of what change might bring. And time again, I see politicians of all hues failing to put their trust in the people. We tell them they can have a school in every village, a university in every large town, a bypass for every major settlement, and a railway to almost everywhere. And worse still, even if it was affordable, very often we don't have the courage to tell them why it would still not be a good idea or in their interests. And of course, routinely in opposition, politicians of all hues promise the undeliverable and, unsurprisingly, fail to deliver. So in my mind, trust is something that must be given first. You have to give trust before you can claim it. And unless we show that we as politicians are free from that anxiety of trusting people, of trusting the electorate, then we cannot expect them to have trust in us. And so to restore trust between the governors and the governed, we must begin by showing that we trust the people in deciding their own destiny. We must recognise that we are all citizens of a republic of conscience that we all want to create and in which we all have to share and have a responsibility in making it a success. And personally, like the other speakers, I dislike this whole idea of addressing this question in terms of the governed and the governors. Politicians are really only custodians of people's trust, the short-term guardians of their rights. And the people are much more than the simply governed. They're sovereign. As Michael Collins said, we must govern not to rule, but to serve. The papers backing up this session particularly refer to the Council of Europe document on public trust and democracy. And I think I would challenge one element of that. In it, it claims that the financial collapse had eroded faith in representative democratic institutions across Europe, and that the bonds of trust had been damaged, and that people felt betrayed and lost faith in democracy as a result. And I have to say I actually disagree with that. People certainly lost faith in a lot of things. They lost faith in the banks, in the political parties which made the wrong decisions, in the economic system which brought about such profound failures. But I don't think they lost faith in the democratic process itself. People did not want to see their republic, their democracy, their republic of conscience replaced with a closed system of fear or autocracy or extremism. Instead, what they asked mainstream politicians to do is to prove that they still deserve their trust and that the political and economic sovereignty and self-respect that they'd been used to could be restored. And that said, while I disagree with the diagnosis in that document, I'm more impressed with the prescription it presents. It suggests that sound states are based on sound democracies, and to become strong, democracies need to make existing democratic structures much more representative. So what's needed are more democratic elements carefully designed in order to increase citizens' participation and promote active citizenship. Greater participation by the people through active citizenship is the only solution to the anxiety of trust that we suffer from. I was very fortunate to grow up in a house in which active citizenship was encouraged. My father was a local GP, my mother a nurse, and while it wasn't a party political household, discussion about politics and religion and even money were to be encouraged. And I was always brought up to believe that politics and politicians could do great deeds and really change things. And so at the age of 20, I ran for election to the local council. I lost miserably, receiving just 380 votes. But I'll never forget that engaging in that process and what it taught me at that age. Because through meeting people on the campaign trail and sharing their concerns, I was really struck by a public idealism about politics that has never left me. Most people still believe deep down that politics can be a force for good, or at least they believe it should be, and so do I. And so I had my own youthful vision, if you like, of a republic of conscience, and I've tried to honour that as best I can in everything that I do, no matter whether it was popular or unpopular, whether people wanted to hear it or did not, whether it was damaging or distinguished. And it's really why I was so honoured to be asked to serve as Minister for Health, because even though the challenge is daunting and truly enormous, it is for these challenges that we get involved in politics so we can try and make things just a little better. And so I have to say I'm in fact delighted to be serving on this panel with, of course, Ministers for Health, past, present and perhaps even future. I know Sean O'Rourke earlier joked about 3 future Taoiseachs, so I just couldn't miss out on the opportunity for that one. But I do note that he didn't say in which order that would happen, so he might wish to comment on that later on. I think really the question before us is about restoring trust. And that takes for granted that trust has been eroded and that uncritical trust is a good thing. But trust can be a negative as well as a positive. And sometimes we can trust too easily, and our republic of conscience can be damaged as a result. And although I have enormous respect for Deputy Martin and Deputy MacDonald as individual politicians, I have to say I have serious concerns about their parties operate and have operated in the past. And I think we see there classic examples of where trust blinded us to the truth and Irish life was damaged as a result. When another former leader of Fianna Fáil, and indeed another former health minister, Charles J. Haughey, was in power, few questioned the source of his wealth. We were prepared to take on trust that had been secured legitimately, even though the evidence suggested otherwise, and all our instincts should have demanded that we speak out. And at that time, there was a collective failure of media, of politicians and of the public. But the guilt was far greater, I think, in his own party. There were no whistleblowers, and those that maybe came close were expelled. So instead of having a healthy anxiety of trust, Fianna Fáil at that time suffered from an anxiety of truth and preferred to believe in its own fictional narrative rather than face the reality. And of course that theme has continued down through the decades to another former Taoiseach with complex financial affairs, to the rise of the property bubble and the inevitable collapse of the Celtic Tiger. And so I think it's the untruths that we tell become part of the untruths that we live. We allowed ourselves to believe that we created some sort of economic miracle that would endure for all time. And of course, we are still paying the consequences of that conceit. So trust is not always a good thing, and loyalty is not always a good thing either, in my opinion. And I think what perhaps we could take some ideas from could even be Ronald Reagan in his dealings with the Soviet Union. And he went to Reykjavik, you'll remember that time, and began those talks on disarmament, and said that he would trust the Soviet Union, but he'd also verify. And I think perhaps that is a good principle that we should adopt too. And during those years of power, those long years of Fianna Fáil power, I think quite frankly it would have been better if people had less trust in their politicians, so that the truth of what was going on could have been more quickly challenged and exposed. And the same might be said about our trust in the Church, in charities, the Gardaí, to name but a few. And in my opinion, I think Sinn Féin also suffers from an anxiety of truth, because it refuses to trust the people about the truth of its past. Its members defiantly proclaim that their president has nothing to answer for about his IRA activities in the past, blindly insisting that there is no story to tell, even though such claims are increasingly hollow and hard to believe. And the general public, I think, doesn't believe those denials. But as a public, we're prepared to go along with a convenient reworking of history for the sake of greater good, peace on our island. And it brings to mind, to me, Michael Longley's great poem, Ceasefire, where the Trojan War is used to explain and explore the horrible compromises that sometimes are made for peace. As the king suggests at the end, I must now get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. And we've all decided what must be done for the sake of continuing peace on this island, and perhaps that's the right decision. But until Sinn Féin trusts the people enough with the truth about its own past, until it's willing to put forward an honest CV to the Irish public, it can never expect the majority of people to trust it on the key political issues of our time. Otherwise, all we're doing is signing up to more false leadership based on evasion rather than genuine idealism, and this country, I think, has had too much of that. As I suggested, trust must be given first before it can be claimed. And while Fianna Fáil's great failure was that it claimed too much trust and then betrayed it, Sinn Féin's great failure is that it never trusted the people in the first place. And I think it would be better if people had trust in their politicians, but that trust should never be uncritical, and it should always be earned. For the government's part, the efforts that we've made to regain trust have centred mainly around economic repair and political repair. On the economy, we've sought to regain trust of the people by demonstrating that once again we can run our affairs as a country again, balancing the books, reducing the debt, rebuilding the banking system and exiting the bailout. We've also sought to repair politics, and I know we don't get much credit for any of that, but it is for that reason important to record a few concrete examples. We have introduced an effective ban on corporate donations, at long last implementing the key recommendation of all those tribunals that Deputy MacDonald referred to, and ending that link between money and business and politics. We've introduced quotas to ensure that there are many more female candidates in the next general election, and certainly I think because of that, the next Dáil will be a more diverse and a much better place. And I do welcome the fact, while it's gone largely unnoticed, that in the most recent European elections, for the first time, the Irish people elected more female MEPs than male ones. We've had the most extensive reform of local government since 1898. Legislation to protect whistleblowers has gone through the Houses, and legislation to regulate lobbying is going through them now. We have the Constitutional Convention, and many referendums will flow from that you will vote on next year. We have more powerful Oireachtas committees, and while it may be the case that some of them overstepped the mark in recent times, they have done good work. And one of the key things they do now is pre-scrutiny of legislation, seeing bills at heads of bid stage so that TDs and senators can have a real input into legislation before it's written. In the past it was written, run by the social partners and just rubber stamped in the Dáil. We do have much longer Dáil sessions, but not just for the sake of it. What we have are the Friday sessions now where TDs can put forward their own legislation. And in many cases that legislation is accepted, and I've managed to do that a few times in my previous role. We require newly appointed chairmen of state bodies to be vetted before committees, and there are many other reforms on those lines. Admittedly, though, sometimes we have been unsuccessful. We lost the referendum on abolishing the Seanad, and we lost a referendum on the Oireachtas inquiries. And we have to accept the public's wisdom in that regard and their decisions, and we do. And yes, sometimes we've fallen short of our own standards, and while I'm embarrassed to admit that, I'm not afraid to do so. But I do challenge anyone to look back at any government in recent times and pick out any alternative government that's done as much in this space in the course of 3.5 years. But I think what's required really is much more than all of that. For those of us who love politics, and I think most of us here probably do love politics, we obsess about things like the whip system and electoral reform and list systems and the electoral commission and all that sort of stuff. But for most people, what they want from their politicians is actually much more practical. They want a secure job to go to, they want decent take-home pay, and they want quality public services. They don't necessarily expect the government to deliver all of those things, but they do expect the government to help. And in that regard, we have a long way to go to restore living standards to where they should be, and thereby restore public trust in the political system's ability to deliver what is actually most important to them. And so to finish as I began, with Seamus Heaney, Heaney came to terms with his own anxiety of trust by finding courage within himself and reaching out for an idealism that could be shared by all. He realised that sometimes you need to walk on air against your better judgment. And in Ireland we face a difficult choice between suffering from an anxiety of trust, one that afflicts politicians as much as the people, or to go to the other extreme and suffer from an absence of truth. So clearly it would be better if we could learn from the lessons of the past, and perhaps here once again we can take our inspiration from Seamus Heaney. One solution as we try to create our Republic of Conscience is to seek to balance trust and truth, to use truth as a safeguard to protect our values and trust as an inspiration to lead us to greater things. Thank you.